Welcome to extraMarks, and we're asking the question, who was Mark, and when did he write this account of Jesus' life? And there's quite a lot to say. I'll try to say it briefly and give you enough leads to look into more things from the scriptural evidence of who Mark is. He was a believer in the early church, mentioned directly only in the book of Acts. John Mark, John the Hebrew name, Mark the Latin one. Many people in this time, Jesus' time, had two names. He's first mentioned as a son of a woman named Mary in Acts chapter 12 verse 12, and Mary's spacious house in Jerusalem was being used as a place for believers to gather in and to pray. Maybe the same place recorded in Mark 14 and Acts 1, a place where they gathered before Jesus' death and then after his death and resurrection. And later Mark's mentioned as a companion of Barnabas and of Paul in their travels together, Acts 12:25. John Mark was also Joseph or Barnabas's cousin. Why did I say Barabbas? Barnabas, son of encouragement, or close relation. Colossians 4 verse 10. He was wealthy, Acts 4 verse 36, and it may well have been that he was born actually in North Africa, so he may well have been African. John Mark, so therefore he spoke Aramaic, Greek, Latin. We know that from the Gospel, from the time as well. And if he was from North Africa, he probably spoke Libyan, and being from a Hebrew background, Hebrew. So Mark is a serious guy. His language skills alone are quite amazing. He's a helper, therefore you can see what a help he would have been just from that with Paul. And Barnabas' first missionary journey in Acts 13 verse 5. But famously he didn't stay the whole trip, did he? He deserted Paul and Barnabas at Pamphylia and left the work, Acts 15:38. We're not told why Mark deserted, but his departure came right after a fruitless or seemingly fruitless time in Cyprus in Acts 13. There was just one conversion recorded in Cyprus, and strong demonic opposition. So it's possible that the young John Mark was discouraged by the hardness of the way and decided to return to the comforts of home. We're just not told. But sometime later, after Paul and Barnabas returned from their first journeys, Paul expressed a desire to go back to the brothers in the cities that they had previously visited. This Acts 15 verse 36. Barabbas agreed, apparently, yes, if we can take John Mark with us. And Paul refused to have Mark on the trip, citing his previous desertion of them. And so they had a sharp disagreement between them, Paul and Barnabas, about him. Acts 15:39. They wound up separating from each other and going on their separate journeys. Barnabas took John Mark with him to Cyprus, and Paul took Silas with him through Syria and Cilicia to encourage the churches and the believers in those areas. Maybe Barnabas really was living up to his name of a son of encouragement to give John Mark a second chance. Maybe it was a cousinly thing, maybe it was both. Luke doesn't take sides, he just records the facts, and it's just worth noting that in God's sovereignty, two missionary teams were therefore formed out of this disagreement, spreading the gospel. Well, John Mark sails off to Cyprus with his relative Barnabas, but that isn't the end of the story. And there's a lovely bit when Paul was in prison in Rome, his second time in prison. He calls Mark his fellow worker in Philemon chapter 1 verse 24, and near the end of Paul's life, Paul sends that lovely request to Timothy from a Roman prison. Get Mark, he says, and bring him with you, because he's helpful to me in ministry. 2 Timothy 4:11. So obviously John Mark matured through the years and through the ministry he had in the three known continents, Asia, Europe and Africa. He became a faithful servant of the Lord, and Paul recognised his progress and considered him a valuable companion. And Peter refers to Mark as his son in 1 Peter 5 verse 13. Probably a reference to spiritual relationship, but maybe they were related in some way too. So John Mark wrote the account of Jesus' life that bears his name sometime between AD 55 and AD 59. And there might be a veiled reference to Mark within the Gospel. Mark 14:51 to 52. There's a young man who, roused from sleep the night that Jesus was arrested, attempts to follow Jesus, and the mob who have him in custody attempt to seize him, and the young man escapes and flees into the night. It's only recorded in Mark's Gospel, and the fact that this young man is anonymous makes some people think this was in fact Mark himself. And Eusebius, Jerome and Peter of Alexandria say that Mark was martyred in AD 68. So that gives us some sense of Mark, his character, his life a little bit, and the fact that just so soon after Jesus had died and risen again, he was writing this Gospel. So before 60 AD, within 30 years of Jesus' death and resurrection, Mark wrote his Gospel.